Michael was a man who seemed to have everything, yet he carried a loneliness inside that no money could cure, and this loneliness followed him even on the night that would change his life forever. He was one of the youngest and most powerful CEOs in America, a billionaire who owned shining towers, luxury cars, and private jets, and yet his heart felt like an empty room, echoing with silence after the applause of his business victories faded away. That evening, after a long meeting that stretched late into the night, Michael decided to drive himself home rather than rely on his driver, perhaps because he wanted to feel some sense of normalcy, perhaps because he wanted to escape into the quiet streets with only the hum of the engine as company. The city was falling asleep when he entered an old neighborhood, far from the polished glass walls he usually lived within. His expensive car, sleek and powerful, suddenly began to sputter, the headlights dimming, and within moments the engine gave up, leaving him stranded on a nearly empty street. He stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that did not belong in that part of town, and opened the hood of the car, though he knew nothing about engines or machines. While he bent down, trying to call his driver on the phone, he sensed a sudden movement in the corner of his eye. Two masked men stepped out of the shadows, their faces hidden, their voices low, their footsteps quick. The street, once silent, now felt heavy with fear. Michael's heart raced, and his mind froze in shock. They moved toward him with a sharpness that spoke of danger, their hands holding objects that glinted under the faint streetlight, and Michael understood in that instant that his life, so full of luxury, could be stolen in a heartbeat. Fear gripped him, not the kind he felt in business when millions of dollars were at stake, but a raw fear that comes when a man realizes he might not see another sun rise. His body stiffened, his voice failed, and he wondered if this was how all his achievements would end, in silence and in darkness. Just as the masked men came closer, ready to corner him, a sound broke the tension, the clang of metal hitting metal, sharp and sudden, followed by the firm voice of another man. From across the street, Robert, a humble mechanic who worked late at his small garage, had seen the scene unfolding. His hands, rough from years of fixing broken cars, carried a heavy wrench, and his eyes carried the courage of someone who lived with struggle every day but never allowed fear to win. Without a second thought for his own safety, Robert ran forward, shouting to draw attention, swinging the wrench with strength that came from protecting his own life countless times. His sudden arrival startled the attackers, who were not expecting resistance in the quiet neighborhood. One of them stepped back, muttering nervously, while the other tried to stand firm, but Robert's courage was too much. Michael, frozen in place, watched as Robert forced them back, his voice steady, his arms moving with fierce determination. The attackers, realizing the fight was not worth the risk, finally disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of their retreating steps. The street grew silent once more, but now it was filled with heavy breathing, the kind that comes after danger has passed. Michael, still shaken, looked at the man who had just saved his life. He saw not a suit, not a polished figure, but a simple man in oil-stained clothes, his hands calloused, his face lined with the marks of hard work, and yet he looked more heroic than anyone Michael had ever known in his world of wealth and fame. Struggling to find his voice, Michael whispered his thanks, words that felt too small for what had just happened. Robert shrugged, as if it was nothing extraordinary, and simply said, "Anyone would have done the same." But Michael knew deep in his heart that not everyone would risk their own safety for a stranger, especially for someone like him who belonged to a world far removed from this street. At that moment, under the dim light, Michael felt something stir inside him, a feeling of gratitude that ran deeper than anything he had experienced in boardrooms or celebrations of victory. The man who had saved him asked for nothing, showed no sign of fear, and treated him as just another human being. It was in that quiet moment, between the beating of anxious hearts and the soft sound of night returning to normal, that the first thread of an extraordinary story was woven. Michael had come into that neighborhood as a stranger, a man of wealth who thought he had control of his life, but he left it with a new realization that sometimes destiny begins in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the most humble of people carry the greatest courage. The next morning, when the golden sunlight filled his glass-walled office, Michael found himself unable to concentrate on the stack of papers waiting for his signature, nor on the steady hum of voices outside his door, nor even on the important call lined up with international investors, because his mind kept returning to the dimly lit street from the night before and to the man who had stepped out of the shadows with nothing but courage in his heart and a wrench in his hand. Robert had seemed so ordinary in appearance, dressed in worn-out clothes with grease stains, yet there had been something extraordinary about him, something that money could never buy and influence could never create. All day long Michael replayed the moment when he had looked into Robert's eyes and seen no fear, only determination. For a man who lived surrounded by bodyguards, assistants, and admirers who rarely spoke to him without formality, the memory of Robert speaking to him in such a simple, unaffected tone felt refreshing, like a glass of clear water after years of drinking from crystal goblets filled with emptiness. That evening, despite the protests of his driver and security team, Michael decided to return to that neighborhood. His car, now repaired by his company's mechanics, glided smoothly along the road, but his heart carried a nervous energy. When he arrived at the small garage with the faded sign that simply read Robert's Auto Repair, he saw the man bent over the hood of an old truck, his hands moving with practiced care, his face marked with concentration. Michael stepped out of his car, not as the billionaire CEO but as a man filled with gratitude. Robert looked up, surprised to see him again, and wiped his hands on a cloth, asking if there was some problem with the car. Michael shook his head and smiled faintly, saying he had come not because of the car but because of what Robert had done. He offered a brief thanks again, but this time, he pulled out a check from his jacket pocket, a generous amount that could have changed a small business forever. Robert glanced at it, then pushed it back gently, shaking his head. "I didn't do it for money," he said calmly, "I just did what was right." For a moment, Michael was speechless, because in his world almost everyone had a price, and yet here stood a man who could not be bought. That night, instead of leaving quickly, Michael stayed, leaning against a wall of the small garage while Robert continued his work, and they began to talk. At first, it was simple, about cars and engines, topics Michael barely understood but listened to with interest. Soon, however, the conversation drifted toward life, dreams, and struggles. Robert spoke about how he had inherited the garage from his father, how he worked long hours to keep it running, and how he never cared about wealth as long as he could live with honesty and dignity. Michael, for reasons he could not fully explain, began to share parts of his own story, how he had built his company from scratch, how success had cost him his friendships, how people treated him with respect but rarely with sincerity, and how deep down, despite all his achievements, he felt an emptiness that refused to go away. The hours slipped by, and for the first time in years, Michael felt he was speaking to someone who saw him not as a CEO or as a billionaire but simply as a man. Over the next days, Michael found excuses to visit the garage again. Sometimes he brought coffee, sometimes he brought nothing at all, and sometimes he just came to sit quietly while Robert worked. Each time, their conversations deepened, touching on values, on family, on choices in life. Slowly, Michael began to feel that he had found something rare, something he could not put into words. It was not just gratitude anymore, it was trust. He had lived his life surrounded by people who admired his wealth, but Robert admired only truth and simplicity, and that difference made Michael return again and again. One afternoon, Michael invited Robert to his office, a tall building of glass that touched the sky. Robert walked into the marble lobby with curiosity but no awe, and when they reached Michael's floor, instead of being impressed by the luxury, Robert simply smiled and said, "It's just a bigger version of my garage, isn't it? Work is work, no matter the walls around it." Michael laughed, a genuine laugh he had not felt in years, and realized that Robert had the gift of stripping away illusions. Their bond grew stronger, and it was during one of those visits that Michael introduced Robert to Jennifer, his childhood friend who now worked as a teacher. Jennifer was kind-hearted, full of warmth, and she immediately noticed the honesty in Robert's eyes. She admired how he spoke without pretension, how he respected people regardless of their place in society, and how he carried himself with quiet strength. Though their meeting was brief, something gentle stirred between them, a spark that neither spoke of but both silently recognized. For Michael, it was another revelation, because through Robert and now through Jennifer's interest in him, he saw the beginning of something pure and human, far from the artificial smiles and shallow compliments of his usual circles. He realized then that his life, once defined by endless business goals and lonely nights, was slowly being touched by something richer, connections that were not built on contracts or profits but on truth, courage, and perhaps even love. And though he did not yet know where it would lead, he sensed that his journey with Robert was only beginning, a journey that would soon weave Jennifer's presence into it and create a story larger than any boardroom victory he had ever achieved. As the weeks turned into months, Michael's visits to Robert's garage became a quiet routine that he looked forward to more than the high-profile meetings that filled his calendar, because in that small space filled with the smell of oil and the sound of tools, he found a peace that no luxury office could give him, and in Robert's steady voice and honest laughter, he discovered a friendship that made him feel alive again. It surprised everyone who worked with Michael, because the billionaire CEO who once guarded his time like a treasure now often disappeared for hours, leaving behind puzzled assistants and irritated board members, but Michael did not care, because he knew that what he was building with Robert was far more valuable than any deal signed on paper. Robert, too, began to notice how much Michael enjoyed the ordinary rhythm of the garage, whether it was handing him a wrench, sipping coffee from a paper cup, or simply sitting on a stool while Robert worked on an engine, and though Robert never said it aloud, he understood that Michael was learning to live differently, to breathe in simplicity rather than constant ambition. Their bond deepened further when Jennifer entered their circle more often, for she had been intrigued by Robert from their first meeting, and whenever Michael invited her along, she found herself enjoying conversations that had nothing to do with wealth or status but everything to do with kindness, honesty, and dreams. She would sit on an old chair by the garage door, watching Robert fix cars, listening as he spoke about his father's lessons, about working hard with dignity, and about how every machine had a story, just like every human being. Slowly, a warmth began to grow in Jennifer's heart, one that she could not ignore, because Robert was unlike anyone she had ever met, humble, strong, and unshaken by the noise of the world. Michael noticed it too, and instead of feeling left out, he felt a quiet happiness, because he knew that Robert deserved someone as gentle and sincere as Jennifer, and he, in turn, felt blessed to witness their connection unfold. The three of them began to spend time together beyond the garage, sometimes walking through a nearby park, sometimes sitting at a small diner that Robert liked, sometimes even visiting Michael's mansion, where Robert always looked slightly out of place among the expensive furniture but never uncomfortable in his own skin. For Michael, These gatherings were unlike the grand parties he usually hosted, because here there were no false smiles, no hidden agendas, just laughter and honest words shared over simple meals. One evening, while sitting in Michael's backyard under the glow of soft garden lights, the conversation turned toward dreams for the future. Jennifer spoke about wanting to open a small community school for children who could not afford expensive education, her eyes shining with hope. Robert, listening carefully, nodded and said he admired her vision, and though he had little to offer in terms of money, he promised he would always stand by her side to support it with his hands and his hard work. Michael sat quietly, his heart touched by their sincerity, and for the first time he realized that his own wealth could serve a greater purpose when combined with their genuine dreams, and he offered to fund Jennifer's vision without hesitation, not as charity but as a partnership built on trust. Jennifer's eyes filled with gratitude, Robert's face lit up with pride, and in that moment, the three of them felt bound together by something deeper than circumstance, something that was shaping all their lives. As the bond grew stronger, challenges began to appear too, because not everyone around Michael understood his choices. His business partners began to whisper about his constant time away from the company, some questioned why he was spending so much energy on a mechanic and a schoolteacher, and a few even warned him that such friendships could harm his image in the ruthless world of business. Michael listened to them but did not let their words shake his conviction, because he knew in his heart that Robert and Jennifer had given him something no business could: truth, loyalty, and love. In the same way, Robert quietly battled his own doubts, because he wondered if a simple mechanic like him could truly belong in the life of a woman like Jennifer, who carried grace and intelligence that seemed far beyond his reach. But every time Jennifer smiled at him with warmth, every time she spoke to him as though he were her equal, his doubts began to melt away. For Jennifer, the growing affection she felt for Robert was both exciting and frightening, because she had always imagined her life following a safe and predictable path, but now she found her heart drawn towards someone who lived in a world far different from hers, yet who made her feel more secure than anyone ever had. The evenings they spent together became longer, the conversations deeper, and slowly, their lives began to intertwine in ways that none of them had expected. Michael, watching his two friends draw closer, felt a strange kind of joy, because though he was used to being the center of attention in his world, he now preferred being the quiet witness to a story that felt more important than his own fame. The transformation in him was noticed by those close to him. He smiled more, he laughed more, and he seemed lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. And deep inside, Michael knew that the night his car had broken down was no accident, it was fate guiding him to the people who would change his life forever. And as he looked at Robert and Jennifer sitting side by side, their faces glowing in the soft evening light, he realized that the most valuable treasures in life were not found in banks or stock markets but in the simple and powerful connections of the human heart. As the bond among Michael, Robert, and Jennifer grew stronger, life began to test them in ways they had not expected, because whenever something pure and genuine blooms in a world often filled with pride and judgment, challenges are never far behind. Michael's business empire, though powerful, was surrounded by people who valued image and influence above all else, and his constant time with Robert, a humble mechanic, and Jennifer, a simple teacher, became a subject of quiet gossip among his board members and partners. Some felt threatened, some felt confused, and others simply thought Michael was losing focus. They whispered that he was damaging his reputation, and one evening, during an important meeting, a senior partner openly questioned him, asking why the CEO of a billion-dollar company was spending so much time in a rundown garage instead of attending to global deals. Michael listened patiently, but instead of anger, he responded calmly, saying that success without meaning was empty, and though his words were clear, the room filled with uneasy silence, because many of those men had never heard him speak with such conviction about something beyond profit. Outside the world of business, Robert faced his own battles, because though he never sought attention, people in the neighborhood began to notice how often Michael visited his garage, and some treated Robert with jealousy, saying he was using Michael's friendship for money or fame, even though the truth was that Robert had refused every offer of wealth and had remained the same man he had always been. Robert's heart was heavy at times, but Jennifer stood by him, encouraging him to ignore the voices of doubt, reminding him that the value of a man's character was not decided by rumors. Still, Robert sometimes wondered if their worlds were too different, if one day Michael would be forced to step away because of the pressure, or if Jennifer might feel burdened by the differences in their lives. Jennifer, too, faced questions from her colleagues, who asked her why she was spending so much time with a mechanic when she could have chosen someone more polished, more stable in society's eyes, but Jennifer smiled at them gently and said that the heart does not measure worth in titles or money, it measures worth in kindness and truth, and in Robert, she had found both. The turning point came when Michael's company was suddenly thrown into a scandal, not because of him directly but because a group of executives had been caught manipulating accounts for personal gain. The media erupted with headlines, cameras chased him everywhere, and critics used it as an opportunity to question his leadership. For days, Michael stood in the middle of storms of accusations, and though he knew he was innocent, the pressure of the world weighed heavily on him. His so-called friends in business began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with him until the matter cleared, but Robert and Jennifer never wavered. Robert would come to his house late at night, sitting silently with him just so he would not feel alone, and Jennifer would call him every morning, reminding him that storms pass and truth always finds light. Their loyalty during his darkest days touched Michael's heart in ways he could never describe, because he realized that while the world judged him for appearances, these two people stood by him for who he truly was, not for his wealth or power. The strength they gave him helped him fight through the scandal, and when the truth finally came out, clearing his name completely, Michael felt more victorious than he ever had before, not because of his restored reputation but because he had seen with his own eyes who truly cared for him when everything seemed lost. Around the same time, Robert and Jennifer's bond deepened into something undeniable. Their quiet affection had grown into love, visible to anyone who saw the way they looked at each other, the way Jennifer's face lit up when Robert spoke, the way Robert's usually calm eyes softened when she was near. Yet Robert, humble as he was, sometimes feared he could never give Jennifer the life she deserved, because he could not offer wealth or luxury, only his heart and his hands. Jennifer, however, reassured him again and again that what she valued most was not what he could buy but who he was. Michael, watching this love grow, felt nothing but happiness, because he knew his friend deserved such joy, and he encouraged Robert not to let fear hold him back. But as their story unfolded, more challenges arose, because love, like friendship, is often tested. Michael's rivals tried to use Robert's background to embarrass him, spreading stories in the press about the CEO who spent time with a mechanic, calling it a weakness, a distraction, even a scandal of its own. Michael faced reporters who asked sharp questions, but instead of hiding, he answered proudly that Robert had saved his life and had taught him more about strength and loyalty than many men in suits ever could. His honesty surprised the world, and though some mocked him, many others admired his words, because they revealed a side of Michael that was rarely seen: a man who valued people above appearances. Robert, though uncomfortable with the attention, stood firm, and Jennifer continued to support both men, becoming the quiet thread that held them together during the trials. Slowly, the noise began to fade, and what remained was stronger than before. Their friendship had survived pressure, their love had survived doubt, and their hearts had survived judgment. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing became clear to all three of them: they had found something worth protecting, something rare in a world so often blinded by power and wealth. The months that followed carried with them a gentler rhythm, a softer air of peace that settled over Michael, Robert, and Jennifer, as if life itself had decided to reward their courage with moments of quiet joy, and slowly, what had begun as an unexpected meeting on a dangerous night transformed into a lasting bond that none of them could have imagined. Michael, free now from the heavy cloud of scandal, began to devote more of his time and resources to meaningful projects, many of which were inspired by conversations he had shared with Robert and Jennifer, and one of the most important among them was Jennifer's dream of opening a small community school for children who came from struggling families. With Michael's financial support, Robert's hard work, and Jennifer's vision, the dream began to take shape, and soon the walls of a modest but bright school rose from the ground in a quiet neighborhood, filled with laughter and the promise of new beginnings. It was during this time that Robert finally found the courage he had been carrying silently in his heart, because though he had loved Jennifer deeply for months, he had always hesitated, worried that his simple life could not give her all that she deserved. But watching her teach children with patience and grace, watching her smile even on the hardest days, he realized that love was not about wealth but about standing together. And so, one evening, when the school was nearly complete, Robert gathered his courage and proposed to her. It was not in a grand hall or under shining chandeliers but in the very courtyard of the school they had built together, under the soft glow of lanterns, with children's drawings hanging on the walls like decorations of innocence and hope. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of joy, and with a smile that carried more light than any jewel, she said yes. The small crowd of workers and friends who were present clapped and cheered, and in that moment, Robert felt richer than he had ever imagined he could, because he had won the heart of a woman who saw him not for what he lacked but for who he was. Michael stood nearby, his own eyes moist, for he knew that this love was born from the same night that had nearly taken his life, and he felt grateful beyond words that fate had led him to these two people. In the days that followed, preparations for Robert and Jennifer's wedding brought a new kind of excitement into their lives. Unlike the extravagant events Michael was used to, this celebration was simple, warm, and full of genuine affection. Friends from the neighborhood, children from Jennifer's classes, even workers from Michael's company, all came together to make the day special. Michael, despite his immense wealth, did not insist on luxury. Instead, he offered his support quietly, making sure every small detail was taken care of without overshadowing the couple's wishes. On the day of the wedding, as Robert stood at the altar in a simple suit and Jennifer walked toward him in a dress that reflected her gentle spirit, the world seemed to pause. Michael watched with a smile, his heart swelling with pride and happiness, because he had not only witnessed a love story but had been part of the journey that made it possible. When Robert and Jennifer exchanged vows, promising to stand by each other through all trials and joys, Michael felt as though he too was making a vow in his heart, a vow to always protect this bond, to always value truth over appearances, and to never forget the night when his life was saved not only from danger but from emptiness. After the ceremony, as laughter filled the air and the couple danced under the stars, Michael stood quietly at the edge of the celebration, reflecting on how much he had changed. The man who once measured life in profits and losses now measured it in moments like this, in the strength of loyalty, in the warmth of love, and in the beauty of simplicity. He realized that his story was no longer about being a billionaire CEO but about being a friend, a witness, and a man who had finally found meaning. For Robert and Jennifer, their journey together had only just begun, but they stepped into it with faith, knowing that their love was strong enough to face any challenge. And for Michael, though he did not yet know what the future held for him, he felt at peace, because he had learned that life's greatest treasures are found not in the shine of gold but in the quiet glow of hearts bound by courage and love. Thus, a night that had started with fear and danger ended with joy and new beginnings, and from that night onward, the three of them carried a story that would forever remind them and everyone who knew them that love, loyalty, and kindness are the true riches of life.